At 3 a.m. on March 9, 1990, 49-year-old Mario Orozco limped home through the streets of Brooklyn. He used a heavy wooden cane as he moved slowly through familiar streets. Despite his poor eyesight and congenital limp, he had a demanding job in the kitchen of a New York restaurant. The late hours of his job required him to take the subway late at night and walk home through nearly deserted streets. Unbeknownst to Orozco, a young man in a beret followed him into the darkness of a nearby cemetery. Without saying a word, the stalker came out of nowhere and shot Orozco in the back with a 9mm pistol. Orozco never even saw the man. Orozco was alive when the police arrived. He was taken to the hospital where he received first aid. Fortunately, he survived. At 3 a.m. on March 29, 1990, 34-year-old Jermaine Montenegro was walking the streets of East New York. He had drunk a little too much alcohol at a bar in the Bronx. The drunk man swayed as he walked. As Montenegro moved slowly, a young man began to follow him. When he got close enough, he fired a shot from behind. As Montenegro fell to the ground covered in blood, the young man searched his pockets. He found a wallet, but left the money behind. He took Montenegro's passport and fled. May 31st, 1990. Joseph Prose liked to walk the streets of East New York and Queens late at night. Prose was 78 years old and used a cane. Around 1:30 a.m., Prose was walking home when a young man followed him. As Prose approached his home, the young man pulled out a zippered handgun and fired one shot. He left an eerie handwritten note next to Prose's wounded body and disappeared. The note read, "This is the Zodiac. When the arcs appear in the sky, the 12 signs will die." The note shocked everyone. Was this the famous Zodiac everyone knew? The only known Zodiac had terrorized San Francisco in the 1960s and had never been caught. Could it have resurfaced now? On the note were 3 signs of the Zodiac in a circle: Scorpio, Gemini, and Taurus. When the detectives investigated, they found that Prose was a Taurus. Previous signs could have been shot like Prose. Mike Shiravola, one of the detectives on the case, thought that this new Zodiac might be the old Zodiac and sent the note to San Francisco. Investigation revealed that the new Zodiac was not the old one. It started all over again. After San Francisco, the curse had reached the streets of New York. Joseph Prose also survived. So far, no connection to the earlier attacks has been established. Attempts to trace the gun that shot Prose were unsuccessful. According to the ballistics report of the bullet found at the scene, the gun that was fired was homemade. It was therefore impossible to trace. While he was alive, Queens detectives questioned him about the attack. Because of Prose's survival, the case was ruled a robbery rather than a murder. Still, 2 detectives, Mike Ciravolo and Bill Clark, were concerned and frightened by the shooter's strange, occult note. Clark had been part of the task force that caught the son of Sam, and both men suspected that this was no ordinary robbery. The file also contained faint fingerprints from Zodiac's letter. Because the first 2 incidents occurred on the Queens-Brooklyn border, Ciravolo was unaware of similar shootings or the earlier letter sent to the anti-crime unit. The New York Post obtained letters similar to the one found at the scene of Prose's shooting. Zodiac wrote in the same bizarre style as his earlier notes, listing the time, place, and date of each shooting, along with the victim's astrological sign. They were all shot in Brooklyn, the letters read. A Post reporter took the note to the Brooklyn police, hoping it was authentic. He was surprised to learn that there had been no murders matching the description in the note. The detectives agreed to continue the investigation, but they also thought the note was a forgery. The note mentioned 3 murders, but no one had died. Because the killer thought the people he shot were dead at the time. Since there hadn't been a murder yet, the detectives didn't have a killer on their hands, just a dangerous shooter. Larry Milanese stumbled upon the note investigation during a visit to the 17th precinct. It had a similar connection to the note left with the victim. He cross-referenced the dates of his previous victims with astrological dates. The detectives successfully located the previous victims, Orozco and Montenegro. Apparently, the Zodiac had moved from Brooklyn to Queens. Over the next few weeks, the The press followed the case relentlessly. New Yorkers began to wonder if the famous Zodiac had returned. Astrologers appeared on television with predictions and explanations. People no longer felt comfortable being asked, "What is your zodiac sign?" Vigilante groups like the Guardian Angels began patrolling East New York. Chiravalo and Milanesi's work impressed Borelli, the chief of police, who put them on the case. Borelli dubbed the effort to catch the Zodiac Operation Watchman and said he would provide assistance if needed. Chiravalo was confident they would catch the Zodiac quickly. Larry Milanesi, one of the Operation Watchman detectives, saw a pattern in the Zodiac's actions. Looking at previous attacks, he found that he attacked at 21-day intervals. The next attack would have occurred between 1 a.m. and 3:00 a.m. on June 21st. That night, many police officers patrolled East New York, both on foot and in vehicles. Of course, this news was leaked to the press. The note to the press was initially thought by detectives to be false. The notes were real. Chiravalo called the reporter with the good news. He asked her to take a few days to investigate other possible victims and not to write down the date they had set for the killer. But on June 19th, the reporter ran the story. The headline said the Zodiac would strike again on June 21st. This upset all plans. The killer now knew he was wanted and even knew when he would strike. There was nothing to do now. The operation had to continue. Unfortunately, they were patrolling the wrong place. 18 days later. Across the East River in Manhattan, a homeless man named Larry Parham made his bed on a bench in Central Park. Before spending the night, he hid his wallet in one of his sneakers. As Parham slept, the young man approached his bench and carefully removed his wallet. He examined the contents but did not touch the money. He stood up and fired one shot. Parham was a cancer survivor and escaped death. The day after the Central Park shooting, the post office received an interesting Zodiac letter. It contained the same occult symbolism, list of victims, time of death, and sun sign. The new Zodiac had not yet committed murder. But when Joseph Pross died in the hospital on June 23rd, the tide began to turn. The danger to the public was now heightened. New York's Zodiac was officially a killer, and the NYPD had to mobilize to stop him. Parham helped police draw a composite sketch. He described the assailant as black, about 30 years old, about 6 feet tall, and weighing about 185 pounds. When the sketch was released to the press, hundreds of calls came in. Unfortunately, the killer Larry Parham described was nothing like the real thing. Operation Caretaker marked August as the date when the stars would reunite in the sky. But nothing happened that day. The Zodiac hadn't attacked in a long time. Soon the Zodiac task force was reduced from 50 police officers to 18. Within a few months, people calmed down and the town stopped worrying about the Zodiac. There was no news until 1992. The Zodiac knew it was time to come back. But it also knew that this time it would have to make some changes to its style. On June 4th, 1992, construction worker Jim Weber was shot in the hip in the middle of the night outside of Highland Park. He was a Libra and survived. On July 20th, 1992, the young man shot 40-year-old mental patient Joseph Diacone at 11:35 p.m. outside Highland Park. The man lost his life. His lifeless body has never been found. On August 10th, 1992, 39-year-old Patricia Fonte met a man near Highland Park Lake. At 1:30 a.m., the man shot Fonte with a .22 caliber zip gun, but Fonte got up and began struggling with the man. In panic, Zodiac stabbed her more than 100 times. The woman died at the scene. The victim was a Leo. On October 2nd, 1992, 40-year-old Diane Ballard was shot while sitting on a bench in Highland Park. She was a Taurus and survived the attack. Police did not connect the two crimes. In a city that was then averaging 5 murders a night, detectives found nothing to connect them. Detective Joe Herbert had just been assigned to the case after Operation Watchman was disbanded. The detective had followed the case for a long time. He knew a great deal about the case. He was also very eager to catch the assailant. and Herbert was sure that the Zodiac was at work, even though there was no note left after those attacks. But there was no more attack. They couldn't go any further with what they knew so far. The case went cold again. Everybody went about their business, and that was the end of 1992. In 1994, a new letter was leaked to the press. According to the letter, Zodiac said it would move forward, but it didn't. The killer took a break or was arrested for another crime. Although fingerprints were taken from the letters at the time, there was no technological database, so the prints couldn't be compared. June 18, 1996. Joe Herbert was transferred to another unit after the case was shelved. In his new unit, he was negotiating with hostages. On June 18, 1996, Herbert was called to the scene when just such an incident occurred. A man had taken his sister hostage and shot her boyfriend. After Herbert arrived, and after about 2 hours of negotiations, the assailant agreed to surrender. Heriberto Seda was taken to the police station, accompanied by police officers. He was being held at the police station for trial after a written statement about the incident was taken. When the written statement was handed to Detective Joe Herbert, Herbert was stunned. The handwriting on the affidavit looked very familiar to him. Herbert had studied the letters from Zodiac so much that he would recognize it anywhere. In shock, he rushed back to the police station. When he told Eddie that he was the Zodiac, the man replied the opposite. After talking about it in the interrogation room for a while, Eddie admitted that he was the Zodiac. Joe Herbert had solved the case of the New York Zodiac in a way he never expected. Heriberto Seda, 22 years old at the time of his capture, was born in 1967. He lived with his mother and half-sister in East New York. He was clean-dressed, handsome, and kept his room spotless. He didn't work, had no friends, and had dropped out of high school at 16 because he was suspended for carrying a gun. He earned money by inserting plastic bags into the return slots of payphones and vending machines. After a few days, he would come back and take out the bag and the money. He didn't get along with girls. He was deeply religious and dedicated his life to God. He went to church regularly, which made his mother proud. Seda and her school-age sister, Gladys, Chachi, Reyes, did not get along well. Reyes was the complete opposite of her sister. She was outgoing, friendly, and had many friends in the neighborhood. As a young child, Seda doted on him, but as he grew older, his brother physically and mentally abused him. She went to school with bruises, and her teachers sent social workers to check on her. Around 1989, the abuse stopped. The two still didn't get along, but Seda no longer beat him regularly. Most of the time, she stayed in her room and pursued her hobbies. Seda liked to read, especially about guns and violence. She liked magazines like Soldier of Fortune and books about serial killers. She idolized the famous serial killer Ted Bundy. Of course, the killer Seda admired the most was Zodiac. He was a mysterious killer because he had never been caught. He was smarter than the cops. He was a servant of God, and his sinful victims would serve him in the afterlife. Heriberto believed in such dark ideas. One of the many books on this subject on Eddie Seda's shelf was Robert Graysmith's Zodiac. Considered by many to be the definitive book on the original Zodiac case, it was the blueprint for Seda's carefully constructed identity. He was the new Zodiac. Since the press coverage began after the Pro Se murder, Seda had collected the news of the New York Zodiac case in a notebook. She kept this notebook alongside the ones she had previously compiled on Ted Bundy, Zodiac, and other famous serial killers. He had a small arsenal of homemade guns and explosives. He ordered ammunition from catalogs, but he assembled a collection of zip guns himself. He knew that with zipper guns he could change the barrels and thus avoid a ballistic match. That way, he wouldn't get caught, not only because he was clever, but also because he believed he had the magic on his side. Still, he was terrified that the magic would be broken. The police had his fingerprints. If he was arrested for any crime, the police would know he was the Zodiac. He took long breaks because he was afraid. As per procedure, the detectives asked Seda to write her confession. At the end of the confession, she drew the famous symbol of the Zodiac. To confirm his suspicion, Detective Herbert wanted to match the fingerprints on her hands with those of the man in front of them. The fingerprints were a perfect match. Seda was definitely the Zodiac. Meanwhile, another detective, Louis Savarese, went to his home to retrieve the Zodiac letters he had hidden in his house. He was obsessed with tracking down the Zodiac and was working on the case in his spare time. They questioned him about every detail of the case. He was confused, tired, and angry. He told his story in full detail. Then he was asked about the sister he had taken hostage. In June 1998, a jury found Heriberto Seda guilty of the New York Zodiac killer. After 6 weeks of trials, he was sentenced to 236 years in prison. Today, Seda remains in prison where he reads the Bible every day and quotes scripture verses to his fellow inmates. After her arrest, she made several attempts to reconcile with her sister. Gladys Reyes rejected her sister's calls. She still lives with their mother in eastern New York. Many of the Zodiac's living victims are still suffering physically and psychologically from the attacks. Some, like the devout Christian Paham, have forgiven Seda for what she did. Others, like Montenegro, refuse to discuss the case. Orozco still lives in East New York and does not let fear stop him from walking the streets or being with friends. The original Zodiac was never caught. It remains a mystery.